Okay, you can start.
Okay, good. So, good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank everybody that's here today with us at Zoom and at YouTube. I also would like to explain for those who don't know yet that the conference will take place in English, but we will make it available in a few weeks, a translated version with subtitles for those who need it. Okay, so I will introduce Professor Cornell now, and after her speech, we will open for questions and discussion. So thank you, Drucilla, for being here with us today. Drucilla Cornell is a professor of political science and studies of women and gender in comparative literature and comparative literature at Rutgers University, New Jersey. A philosopher with large work on philosophy of law studies and feminism. Drucilla is, first of all, a feminist and an activist with important experience in women's social movements and unions in the United States. She has been concerned with thinking about ethical feminism since the beginning of her work, always inspired by socialist, and anti-imperialist and decolonial ideas. With only 3 articles available in Portuguese, we don't get much of Professor Cornell's work in Brazil, but fortunately, we are developing a research project at Tempo do Agora that aims to bring some of Professor Cornell's work to the feminist debate in Brazil, thinking about the imaginary domain and the ethical ideal for feminism. We also think that all the discussion about the principles of law and insights about the South Africa Constitution are essential for all Brazilian philosophy of law. But today, Drucilla will talk about the ethical feminism and the revolution, and we just have to thank you again, and we are so glad, and we are honored to have you here, Drucilla. It's really important for us to hear from you, and I think that's it. You can start now, and later we have some discussion about everything.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored. As you probably know, Donald Trump has called everybody and their mother a communist and a socialist. Well, I am one. All the rest of the people he's named socialists are, in fact, not even close. So I want to emphasize that from the beginning, that we're in a very precarious situation in the United States. And it's not only in the United States. We are seeing the rise of significant fascist movements everywhere. And I grew up, as I said in the paper I sent to Maria, in a world in which everyone was a communist. And there wasn't even a Democratic Party member that I had as a teacher until I was a senior in high school. I also grew up in a completely segregated racist world. And so the idea that we are going back to that is terrifying to me. On the other hand, I've been a lifelong activist, and the only way forward is always through the struggle. That's what we all have to do, and we have to believe, as I said in the philosophy of the limit, that no one can tell us what is impossible. The one favorite quote from Nelson Mandela is he said, "It's impossible until it happens." I want to just say a few things about ethical feminism. The ethical feminism for me was a way of getting feminism out of the narrow reach to which it's often accorded. In other words, feminism is about women and about equality for women. Of course, that is part of it, no doubt. But on the other hand, you needed to think about feminism as being expanded to cover any group of human beings who are pushed below the bar of what we think of as humanity. So for instance, in the peace group, a feminist peace group I organized with Ann Snitow in 2001 called Tape Out the Future, we joined organizations who were, for instance, protesting after 9/11 that certain targeted Muslim groups, even if they had green cards, had to re-register. We saw that as a feminist issue. We also saw that and joined with several Black women's organizations who were fighting because their sons were being given a brutal choice, either go to prison or go to war. As you probably all know, we went to war in an unjust, immoral way with Afghanistan and then later with Iraq. So the idea of ethical feminism was to expand feminism. First, in that it literally moves beyond anything having to do with women, no matter how you define women or not women. As I wrote in the paper I sent to Maria, there's a very clear definition of women when I grew up. No can do, nothing. Maybe a couple of years as a primary school teacher, and then you get married, and that's it. And of course, the justice who brought that all down was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who tragically died after beating cancer for 12 years. So the other side of ethical feminism, though, which is extremely important now, is that there's no way to think about feminism without thinking about anti-Black racism and anti-racism, period. There's no such thing as a woman who doesn't have a color in a thoroughly racist society. So in that sense, I distinguished between position, identity, and identification. My position, which is part of the materiality of how we live in this social world of ours, is that I am a white woman and that I have certain privileges that accord to that, and that I can't step out of them. I can't pretend it's not there. I want to make it clear that this is not about guilt. I know Janet Halley said I love to be guilty, but in fact, it's not about guilt. It's about the recognition of my favorite t-shirt in Black Lives Matter, which says, when Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. In fact, the struggles of Black revolutionaries in the United States, and I would say worldwide, have a claim of universality. As Frantz Fanon said, decolonization demands a whole new species of human beings. So the notion that you can have a feminist that isn't thoroughly anti-racist is what ethical feminism challenged. And it's connected, obviously, to the first part, which extends the reach of the meaning of feminism to all who have been disenfranchised and thrown below the bar of humanity. In my union experiences, I struggled and had to face that there's no solidarity if there isn't anti-racism and the recognition of your position. If you are white, as a kind of white skin privilege that you can own to and struggle so as to undo the privileges. The second aspect is what I called identity. I was raised as a white woman but I wasn't white enough because I had red hair. So my mother made me dye my hair blonde when I entered kindergarten because the Irish were not really seen as white. So whiteness within it always has this notion of class hierarchy. So in a certain sense, the way race and class are often pitted against one another doesn't understand the integral way in which identity is shaped through both. So in this sense, your identity has to do with your language, and I tragically do not speak Portuguese. It has to do with your historical setting. I am, for better or worse, a citizen of the United States, something I sought to escape at one point by moving to South Africa. And I'm an English speaker for the most part. I've tried very hard to learn other languages. So the identity is also a historically embedded material concept. Identification is more fluid. But if I were to tell you that we can be anything we want, I would be falling into the most dreadful neoliberal fantasies. If I told you I was a Zulu woman who spoke Zulu and was a native African, you would say I was psychotic, and you would be right. But you'd also say that I was trying to escape the reality of my position and my identity. You don't just undo those. You have to accept the materiality of our limits. That doesn't mean, however, that white people cannot be active socialists, that white people can and should join the struggles. Anti-Black racism, certainly white people have been been embraced by Black Lives Matter. So I think that in that sense, we always have to remember the distinction between position, identity, and identification. Since many of you are interested in Judith Butler, this is a slight, perhaps significant difference with her. And I would argue that Judith was mainly focusing on identification. When she said, do we need the category of woman in feminism? Well, if you have a definition of no can do, and as I wrote in the imaginary domain, to which I'm going to turn next, if women are denied their basic reproductive rights, they have no claim to be a person, and that defines them. And then it's not just about the right to abortion. It's about the right to maternity leave. It's about the right to Medicare for all, as Bernie Sanders would say. It's about the right to be able to have decent childcare, none of which we have in the United States. And that if you take all of those away, then there is a definition of woman, because woman has no capacity to claim personhood or anything like it, because the state has taken over ownership, and yes, it's ownership, of our reproductive capacities. We're about to see that happen in the United States with this woman who just got put on the Supreme Court. So Judith believed more strongly than I did that you could re-identify yourselves, even around her critique of hate speech. I mean, there's absolutely no question that hate speech should be regulated because you can't recirculate certain words, or I can't. If I use the N-word, no, I can't do it. And no white person can recirculate that word. Can rappers recirculate it? Sure, but they're in a completely different position than I am. So in that sense, there is more of a materialist position recognition on my part than on Judith's. And that's in part because of the activism and because of my confrontation from early on with the horror of racism in the United States. And that's the only word for it, horror. I joined the civil rights movement when I was 15. I did so because there were several high schools after Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated our schools and overturned the Jim Crow laws, which had, black and white bathrooms, black and white drinking fountains, and you go down the list. What affected me was there were several schools after Board versus Board of Education. This is before busing became a mandatory constitutional judgment, where schools volunteered to segregate and bus African Americans into those schools. And a group of white people set fire to a bus with 10 8-year-olds and wouldn't let them out and burnt them alive. After that, I thought there was no way forward for me but to be active in the civil rights movement. I, in fact, volunteered to register in an all-Black high school in South Pasadena, which was the actual city around my gerrymandered community. The San Marino doesn't exist except to keep Black people out and make sure they can't vote. So there's many communities of that sort in the United States. That's not guilt, that's horror. But there could be that kind of cruelty that would ever be accepted left me no ethical choice to be a civil rights activist and an anti-Black racist. So again, I want to now turn to the imaginary domain. One of the reasons that I thought about ethical feminism, in a certain sense, what I've just said means that all feminism is Black feminism, or it's not feminism. Now, that sounds like a strange thing for someone who just said, I'm positioned as a white woman, but it's the case, because there isn't any feminism without anti-racism. And I cannot stress that enough. The imaginary domain was my intervention into a debate that was dividing feminists over pornography. At the time that I wrote The Imaginary Domain, pornography still had movie sites, but there were actual places where people shot movies. That doesn't happen anymore because of the internet. And the women were arguing they were either for the criminalization of pornography, or they were for pornography being about sexual freedom. And I thought neither side was getting to the bottom of what was really at stake in this issue. So before faxes, before the internet, my first move was to find the union organizer, Ona Z. Wiggers. And it took me about 24 hours, but that's all. And all of these academics were fighting with one another, but they never went to the ground. They never went to find the woman who was actually organizing all condom sets. And she was a porn star herself, that she was like the Meryl Streep of porn stars. She'd won 11 awards. Yes, they had award ceremony. And went through death threats, the usual things that happen. And she didn't want to speak to me until I came and joined the picket line, which I was more than happy to do. And when she realized that I'd had a lifetime of fighting on picket line, she was willing to talk to me. I really owe the idea of the imaginary domain to her. If you condemn certain women and look down on their sexuality because you have some kind of sexual freedom that they don't, you're just kidding yourself. So the idea of the imaginary domain is that each one of us has to have the freedom to come to terms of who we are sexually. Of course, that means all rights of the transgenders should be not only accepted, but they should be given full medical care, full support, whether you're bisexual, whether you are they, whether you're an it, however you define yourself, that's for you to do. And so the imaginary domain came out of a deep respect of a woman who put her life on the line to fight for the unionization of porn workers. Now, you see, what was the problem with the academic debate is they didn't know what was going on. Our role was to support Ona Z. Wiggers' union effort. It wasn't to talk about criminalization. You can't unionize if you're criminalized. So from the very earliest days, I have been for the decriminalization of prostitution and the decriminalization of porn work. Then you can unionize. So in this way, the activism of my life informs the way I think. And in fact, I'm working on a book called Thinking Like an Activist, because it always demands that you find the people who are the leaders of the struggle. Not that you just sit in your bedroom, where I'm sitting now, admittedly, with my cat and my dog, but you go to the streets, you find the people, and you join the struggle. That's what gives us our ability to think through new ideas. And the imaginary domain was an intervention saying, this is a much better way, ethically, politically, and legally. I know, Maria, you said you were a lawyer, and to think about the rights of all of us in a broad spectrum, to have, and here Judith Butler is very relevant, the identifications that make us who we are. So in that way, the imaginary domain is integrally linked to ethical feminism. The other side of this is the socialism. And there's no way any of us are going to have anything like freedom or equality or justice, as I understand them, as aesthetic ideas and constants, meaning these ideas are always being reconfigured and reimagined. We never know what they are. They're not on the level of truth, as, say, the old-fashioned communist parties and the Third International tried to make them. At the order of the imagination, which then, through programs, becomes materialized. It becomes part of what leads our struggles. And once you're in a struggle, things will change. What if we did abolish prisons? My daughter's museum is doing an exhibit which is abolitionist now, where the only art is done by prisoners. But they had that. They tried that in Mozambique. Once you abolish prisons, you're left with a whole series of new questions. What is accountability? If you don't punish, what do you do with people who have wronged others? And Black Lives Matter has had to face this contradiction because they're calling for people to be imprisoned. So how do you reconcile being against prisons and hold those cops accountable? So when you move programmatically to a level that seems to be in the direction of justice, you're automatically confronted with a whole set of new questions. And that's why the struggle never ends. So socialism, I am a socialist, and I don't know any more than Rosa Luxemburg did what that means. I know, yes, as she said, some negative decrees. You have to expropriate a lot of the property. But it also meant for her that you had to have the widest possible participatory democracy, because only then would all the creativity of people be unleashed, so we might be able to begin to dream together and build institutions and allow us to be differently. And this is part of the paper I sent you, Maria, about building institutions. We have to be fearless about building institutions. This is why after 9/11, and Snitow and I supported the Revolutionary Association of Afghan Women. Of course, they were called communists and terrorists. They were proudly Islamic, they were proudly socialist, and did they do armed self-defense against the Taliban? You bet. You think you could speak to the Taliban when you're running a gynecological clinic underground and they come to attack you? You think you can go outside and talk to them? So on this level, in my new book, I'm really talking about the different kinds of violence. Because if you think that the Revolutionary Association of Afghan Women are terrorists, you're missing the fact that what they did was inevitable and necessary armed self-defense so that women could have babies in safety. Anne and I supported them to be on the ballot, which they were not denied, in Afghanistan as the feminist demand. And here again, the liberal idea that feminism is about not wearing headscarves. Are you kidding me? Does anybody really know what we're doing with our hair? I certainly don't, except that after having to be a blonde when I was in kindergarten, I decided I'm dying as a redhead. But it's a mere small political statement. So the next step was for Anne and I to form an organization after 9/11. And I've told you 2 examples of the kinds of struggles that we supported that made us different and made us feminist differently and made people perceive feminism differently. But that's an institution. When you create an organization, that's an institution. We need to create institutions. And in fact, that's what Derrida called in one of his least read, but to my mind, most important books on negotiations. You don't make an ethical promise to the other that isn't abstract if you're not building institutions. So we have to risk the politics of building institutions, knowing they're going to be imperfect. And like I said, in the best sense, if we abolish prisons, we're going to have a whole series of new questions. That certainly doesn't mean we shouldn't abolish prisons. We should just get ready for the new questions and the challenges they're going to bring. So I think that what the most important thing is the whole battle between unity and difference. They're clearly, because of my own understanding and position, we are positioned very differently. But that doesn't mean we can't find forms of solidarity, but we can only find them, ironically, if we recognize that there's not just differences, there's privileges, and what those privileges mean and how they play out in our day-to-day lives. So I think if I were to leave any of you with a message, as we are obviously confronting a huge crisis in the United States, is that the struggle will always continue. And that as bad as things can seem, as impossible change can seem, there's never anyone who can tell you that you can't change the world. No one, not the Afro-pessimists, not the people who think that all politics is anti-queer because it turns on heterosexual people wanting children. All of the academics with health insurance and good salaries might tell you that it's not a good idea to get in the street because you're going to get in trouble. And they oftentimes say that about me. I got suspended from Stanford. I got fired from Columbia University for union organizing. Well, so what? I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that because I never was trying to climb to be some kind of privileged academic. But if you know, why do I think that there's a relationship between pessimism and health insurance? Because there is. Because if you don't have health insurance and you can't go to the dentist and you can't take your kids to get the shots that they need, then you have no ability to be pessimistic because you have to fight to survive. So when people say, oh, there's all this pessimism in the academy, yeah, because they had the privilege. Once you have health insurance, God, my grandmother said you have everything. I agree with her. So in that sense, my work from the beginning, including the philosophy of the limit and rereading Derrida and naming it the philosophy of the limit, was to say that all these theories of what is impossible, all these super cool, trendy theories about being, Black people are going to be socially dead and Black Lives Matter can't make a difference. Are you kidding? Black Lives Matter has changed the entire hiring policies, just one tiny example in the museums in New York City. That's one tiny example. So my work has always been against theories of the impossible. And I'd like to just say, that things can seem very grim right now, but we have to have the courage and wherewithal to know that we will keep fighting on. So thank you, and I'm more than open to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Drucilla. It's so inspiring for us because we are now facing a really bad government here too.
I know.
I would say similar to Trump's, but I don't know who's worse right now. So we do have a question from YouTube. I don't know if there is anyone here who would like to make some questions or discuss something.
Maybe, Valkyria, we can start with the questions, the people we are here in Zoom, maybe yes. Maria Luisa Femenias and Sonia Correa, our inviters for yes. For tonight, and us, and after that, if you have time, we do the question of YouTube. Okay?
Sure.
Absolutely.
So we do have two guests here.
So Maria Luisa.
Well, I want to thank Mrs. Cornell because it has been very inspiring, her speech. And I would like to know, how do you feel about the future of feminism nowadays?
How I feel about the future?
I'm sorry, in general.
How I feel about the future?
Of feminism.
I think feminism's never been more important. And, again, I'm starting with ethical feminism. That was my attempt to show that feminism doesn't have to be limited in any of the ways that some theorists have said. Janet Halley is the one who says, I enjoy being guilty. But when you're on the streets all the time, you don't feel guilty. It was in her book, Taking a Break from Feminism, that I objected to. You're going to take a big break. I mean, Ronald Reagan started it, and Donald Trump was going to finish the rights of, well, he's already, by executive order, finished any of the rights of the transgender. They're gone. He just obliterated them. So in that sense, the imaginary domain, as I mean it, and feminism, as ethical feminism, is absolutely at the heart of this. If you take away from women all of their reproductive rights, and we have very, very few in the United States, and frankly, you don't have many in Brazil either. You have a little better. I had a comrade named Roberto Unger who was always running for president of Brazil. So I know something about his programs of welfare reform, at least. So feminism to me has to be at the heart of this. I'm proud to be a feminist. And I'm not a socialist feminist in the narrow sense, but I am a socialist feminist. So we have to be both. We have to be anti-racist, and we have to see this as part of how the struggle for socialism develops. So I guess my answer would be, we must not take a break from feminism right now. We need to say we are feminists, and those who are taking a break from feminism and trying to destroy all the limited reforms. Obviously, if you have the right to abortion, it's paid for. But under the imaginary domain, a woman who imagines her fetus is a baby, then it's a baby. So I don't believe abortion is about choice. You had the choice, you might not have gotten pregnant. The idea of choice, all this liberal rhetoric around it is completely wrong. We need to have a socialist rhetoric. And so I have not, it's not the right of abortion, it's the right to abortion. It's also the right against forced sterilization and all of the other reforms that I mentioned in reproductive freedom. Reproductive freedom has never been more important to be one of our clarion calls. If I am a feminist, and
I think we too. So thank you very much.
Me too. Sonia, maybe you want to do some question?
Yeah. Well, Drucilla, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be in a conversation with you after having read you many occasions. I have two questions for you. The first relates to what you have just said about feminism. And the question refers to the fact that after, we have seen that in history before, but I think that we are seeing right now something that was not there so flagrant in the landscape in which we are moving, which is the evident emergence of right-wing women's movements, organized but also leadership and voices. I would say we have many examples, but given the circumstances, probably Amy Barrett is the best icon of that. And this happens at the same time when within feminism, we have moved.
And 1 second. Come on, Snow, just 1 second. Snow. Come on, there you go. Irene is here. Go down, spend time. I'm sorry, a member of my extended family just arrived. And my dog wants to go out and say hi.
It's the same here, so.
Yeah, we know.
We know.
Species.
Exactly.
So my question is, this happens at the same time when feminism has moved from this unitarian, homogeneous vision of feminism towards the conception and the vision of plural feminism. There are many feminisms. And there's an intellectual, ethical, and political question there. The plurality of feminism and the concomitant emergence of anti-feminist women's movement. How to cope with that paradox and challenge is something that I think we have to think a lot about. And also I would like to hear you a bit on your reflections and experience in South Africa. You have written a lot about South Africa. You know that you have a deep engagement with the country. It's a country that I know as well. I have many friends there. And I follow South African politics from distance. So I would like you to talk a little bit about what the South African experience, what is the contribution it can give us in terms of this notion of plural feminism and the articulation between feminism and anti-racist politics.
Well, thank you very much. I want to start with the right-wing women. Actually, Andrea Dworkin, who was a comrade of Catherine McKinnon, who is not with us anymore, wrote a book on right-wing women. It's actually a very good book. I had a lot of disagreements with Andrea around her position on pornography and prostitution. But it's what she argues, and I agree with her, it's a kind of nostalgia for a world that never existed, but is held out as a big fantasy. So what is that world? Well, it's a world where men can't get divorced, where if you get pregnant, your dad goes out with a shotgun and tells the guy he has to marry you, where all of these so-called liberal feminist rights, like in the United States now, women cannot count on having custody of their children. And if you work, you're likely to lose custody of your children. And of course, if the man then marries a 22-year-old who doesn't work, you're really likely to lose custody of your children. There's an anger at feminists for taking away, and this is what I call white knuckling feminism, taking away certain recognitions of feminine sexual difference. And they're right to be angry about that. There should have been a lot more thought in terms of the litigation, with all due respect to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, about what it meant to strike down all those things. And so I think what we have to do when we speak to right-wing women is address the nostalgia and say, look, some things have to be changed. There has to be a recognition that if you work, you can still be a mother, obviously. I always worked. But when you went just for equality, right? Male, female, women can do it. Women can do it then only if they're like men. And this became a huge problem in feminism. What do you do with the fact that women get pregnant? And so far, it's only women who get pregnant. Now, this may change. And if it changes, we were going to make sure that all of the rights provided but to pregnant people get given to whoever gets pregnant. But right now, it's only what we call women who get pregnant. And that means something to women because there's no maternity leave. None of the things that matter materially were granted just in formal equality. And a kind of horrible but funny decision of Justice Rehnquist that insurance companies didn't have to cover pregnancy because it was a distinction between pregnant people and not pregnant people, and it had nothing to do with women. Then these really smart men spent days trying to figure out the relationship between being a woman and being pregnant. They finally thought there was a relationship. They couldn't articulate it, they couldn't talk about it, but they struck that down. And so insurance companies used to have to cover pregnancy. So I think when I went out and worked a lot on various campaigns, and I've spoken to a lot of right-wing women, they're just desperate. You get left, you're alone, you don't have any solidarity, you live in a suburb, you have to have a car. The only problem with me campaigning is I'm supposed to do 10 minutes and I'd end up doing 4 hours because people were so desperate to have company. So I think we have to address some of these concerns and think about how we're going to change them. And that's part of what inspired At the Heart of Freedom and my critique of what I'm calling white knuckling feminism. I had a law student who had a baby in the elevator because she was told she couldn't leave until she finished her brief. Then she had to pay for the elevator, and needless to say, was fired. But on the other hand, what was her option? So I think we have to take seriously how to rectify some of those problems. Do I think anyone should be paying alimony to a man individually? No, I don't. And yet, if you make more than a man, you will unfortunately have to support him. Now, given the wage differentials, that makes no sense. So if we treat right-wing women, not Amy, what's her face, who's very, very rich and wants to put women in jail who have abortions as murderers. And of course, it's not for paid maternity leave or anything else. She didn't need it. She probably has 7 kids and 7 nannies. Why would she need it? Probably all poorly paid women of color who don't have health insurance. So I think we have to take your question very seriously and think about what equality feminism accomplished and some of the losses that it brought with it, and do it kind of fearlessly. South Africa, to me, I lived there for 2.5 years. I had a National Research Foundation chair, as I mentioned, in Living Customary Law and Indigenous Value. And we worked very closely with the Gay and Lesbian Sangoma Association. And that became very, very important to me. In fact, when I was working to understand Ubuntu, we were doing interviews in the township of Kayamande, and the Sangoma said, if you want to understand Ubuntu, you must come work for me. And I worked for her for several summers when I was living in South Africa before I moved there, to understand what it meant to be a Sangoma in South Africa. And she was out lesbian. And the openness to being transgendered it's all about alignment of the ancestors. So, if your ancestors are out of line, they have to be realigned. So it was very humbling. And I've written an article called Ubuntu Feminism, where the idea of generosity of spirit that recognizes something close to what I call the imaginary domain was part of Ubuntu and part of the way she organized her own spiritual life and the spiritual life of her community. Obviously, to be a Sangoma is a very, 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 very difficult journey. And it's humbling because you realize how little you know about so many things. And people have access to parts of reality that I could never reach. So I think South Africa and the struggle around Indigenous ideals and the recognition of Indigenous ideals is absolutely crucial in terms of its lessons for anti-racist feminism in the United States. And on the other hand, just some of the basic reforms, they have socioeconomic rights. They do have maternity leave. The right to abortion, as you probably know, since you know something about South Africa, the child doesn't enter the symbolic community until the umbilical cord is buried. Until that time, a woman can do whatever she wants to that child. It's not even thought about as abortion. It's thought about as something that once you leave your mother's body, then you can finally say you're part of the community. Until that time, it's up to the woman. And that's just recognized and accepted. It's not even thought about as abortion. So in a certain way, for me, being in South Africa, enriched completely the way I looked at the world. It changed it completely. And in that way, I think South Africa is an incredibly interesting example. This is why I said to you, Maria, that the Bolivian Constitution is trying to do some of the same thing. Now there's, people who think that Indigenous values can't be integrated into the Constitution. I tend to be a constitutionalist. That people like Ramosa, who wrote the first book on Ubuntu, is for parliamentary sovereignty. So these debates about how to recognize Indigenous ideals continue, but the idea that you must recognize Indigenous ideals is now widely accepted. And I'm proud that the Ubuntu Project played some role in that.
Thank you, Drucilla, once again. I think the main special thing that I could read about everything that you talk about Ubuntu, it's the fact that you shows us how it's important and how it's possible to integrate the Eurocentric philosophy and also the African philosophy in that case, right? So that's really special for me when I get in touch with all the subjects. Just want to make this point. We have some questions at YouTube. I don't know if we're gonna have time to make all of them.
I mean, I don't have to leave right at 7.
Yeah, so I just want to say, or ask maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how Rosa Luxemburg's works could help us to think this ethical feminism. I don't know if it's okay for you to summarize it for us a little bit. And
You know, there's three aspects of Rosa Luxemburg, at least, that are absolutely crucial today. The first is her notion that capitalism is always primitive accumulation. So there's never going to be a capitalism that doesn't turn on indentured servitude, ruthless imperial domination, and war, because it's necessary. In this paper I sent to Maria, I described that there were once production companies in Silicon Valley. There aren't now. And where are they? In China, in South Korea, where women have no right to unionize whatsoever. So that's Rosa Luxemburg, that kind of primitive accumulation, that kind of indentured servitude is part and parcel of capitalism, and therefore there is no capitalism without racism. Because the workers who are being oppressed and almost enslaved are always racialized. And that's true when they come into the United States and supposedly do the jobs white people don't want to do. So that's point one. The second is her debate with Lenin. I have a lot of respect for Lenin. He died very young. The Russian Revolution is a terrible tragedy on so many levels. But what Rosa said to Lenin was, you can't confuse the dictatorship of the proletariat with dictatorship. There needs to be the widest, most participatory democracy, so we can actually debate out together how we can live differently. If you oppress, as she said, freedom is always for the one who disagrees. If you repress disagreement, if you don't allow that struggle, then those of us who've been raised in horribly exploitative relationships will not be able to fight together and build institutions that can get us out of them in terms of decolonization. So in that sense, her debate with Lenin is very relevant. I mean, another trend in the academy is we should go back to democratic centralist parties. I was in 4, and I was thrown out of all of them. So my relationship to democratic parties is almost as rocky as my relationship to universities. And Rosa is right about that. So the third part is how we organize. And this is something that means I'm not an anarchist. We may need a new party, we may need new parties, but we have to think about how institutional innovation has to proceed along the lines of ideals, or what I call moral images of freedom. And that's all in Rosa Luxemburg. Was she a feminist? You bet. But did she, like Clara Zetkin, devote most of her life to feminist struggles? Well, the answer really is yes and no. She lived a very innovative life for her time. And of course, she was murdered because of her great popularity. So Rosa Luxemburg has never been more relevant for us thinking about what institutional innovation might look like. She's great.
Thank you. We are gonna translate your last paper from Rosa Luxemburg and for Portuguese. So I hope people could have the access to all this debate in that paper.
And Maria,
I want to thank you once again.
I'm also editing a book with Jane Anna Gordon called Creolizing Rosa Luxemburg, which has a lot of work from South Africa in it, because Rosa is very big in South Africa.
We have time to do some questions of YouTube.
Yeah, I don't have to. My family is not expecting me to be done until 7:30.
Okay, so maybe we could make the questions for you from YouTube by email, and then you see if you could answer for us, if it's okay. I'm not sure, like, because it's 10 to 7 there, right? So I'm not sure if it's gonna be too much. I don't know. What do you think, Drucilla?
I'm happy to answer until we get cut off.
Okay, so the first one.
One question.
Yeah, the first one, it's Professor Cornell. How do you see the matter of feminist claims for labor equality and empowerment and possible pitfalls related to neoliberal propaganda and ways of being? It's a question from Roberta, and she thanks you for tonight. It's also in the chat if you want to check.
What was the first part of the question?
How do you see the matter of feminist claims for labor equality and empowerment and possible pitfalls related to neoliberal propaganda and ways of being neoliberal?
I feel very strongly that a strong feminist labor agenda is absolutely crucial. In other words, if I don't know enough about the Brazilian legislation, but I'm sure I'd be for it. Because we need to have a strong feminist labor movement. And since women are treated unequally in all aspects of life, I'm sure that we need to see the opening up, and I don't know if this has happened in Brazil, but unions have lost all their rights in the United States, which is what I talk about in the paper that I just recently sent to Maria. So labor reform has to be a big part of feminism, because the vast majority of women workers work in jobs that are severely underpaid. And the only immediate reform solution is unionization. And that includes so-called sex work, because as long as sex workers are under the hands of pimps, then you have a serious, serious problem. So unionization of sex workers, which happened in Amsterdam, is absolutely crucial. When I was a kid, I was in a consciousness raising group called Los Granudas, and we actually opened a sex worker prostitutes collective to take on the pimps. And we didn't last more than about 10 months, and we created this machine, which we thought was going to make millions of dollars and therefore support the collective, where every John who came in had to go through the machine. We built it like a car wash, but we didn't take into account a lot of things about men, like size and height. So the men were always getting caught in the machine. So the machine wasn't the $1 million machine that we thought it was. The idea at the end is that a condom would be shot onto the particular penis, and there were just all sorts of problems with this machine. But the idea of organizing all women workers is just at the heart of a feminist program.
It's so many things that we need to talk about once we talk about feminism, that we could be here, I think, for a whole night, and also we're gonna demand more time, right? So I just want to thank everybody that it's making questions at YouTube, but we can't deal with all that. But mainly, Drucilla, just to know that people are making questions about, like, how do you think all the things about like abortions and the transgender could be solved, I don't know, in those times, like those terrible times that we are living here in Brazil, that's similar to you were living there at US. But I think most of it, it's gonna be answered for you at your new book about the importance of the political spirituality, right? Once, like you said, in the spirit of revolution too. So I think once we can translate all your work here, people are gonna be more close to all your thoughts and all your philosophy. I think it's gonna be easier to debate some things, some issues. But mainly, a lot of people are saying thank you for your presentation and for your conference. We are really glad to have you here once again. I don't know if Carla wants to say something more, because
Yes.
I'll let you to finish everything, and thank you once again.
Well, thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Maria Luisa Feminies. Thank you all, all the people who are here to do this possible, and thank you the people who are in YouTube. And so sorry because you don't have time to do all the questions, and I think it's something very important to say that I'm so glad that you are here, Drucilla, with us. And I think it's important to say that feminism has always been unethical. And now it's even more necessary to face the new forms of precariousness of life. So I would like to thank you for your inspirations, words, and thank you, Maria Valkyria Cabral, for making this meeting possible. Thanks very much. Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot for your inspiration, and we are all feminists.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that, Maria, if you want to invite me back sometime, I'm happy to come back and keep answering questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We went to translation your work here in Brazil, and I think it's a very good and necessary work.
Thank you so much. So feel free to ask me back.
We will for sure ask you to be back here.
And when all this craziness ends, I've been to Brazil several times.
Pandemic situation, it's all. Oh my God, my internet, it's a little bit
yes,
unstable.
So we finish?
Yes, I don't know if my internet is a little bit unstable. I don't know if you guys heard everything, but so we are gonna bring you here, Drucilla, if it's possible, and we also will let you know when this version, translated version, it's available, and all the works, the translated papers. We will also let you know about everything we're doing with your philosophy here, right? Thank you once again.
I'm working on a new book with Stephen called The Revolution Continues. So I'm happy to share chapters with you, and I'll continue to send you new things that I'm writing, Maria.
Okay, so we'll be together in this struggle and also in the academics works, and thank you once again.
Thank you so much. Are we leaving now? I never like to cut people off. So.
Don't worry. Thank you.
Thank you for your contributions.